And you were telling me about how you got involved in writing this book.
Yeah, I am very lucky and basically a creature of circumstance that in 1973, I was running a record store in Minneapolis called the Electric Fetus. And it was a great gig because it's still going, print shop there. Just a wonderful store and, kid in a candy shop. I love music and I got to get it all over me. But, Minneapolis is kind of a tough place for a Texas kid to live. And this was my second go round up in Minneapolis. And man, the winters are brutal. And so I wanted to move back home spring of 1973, but home was Fort Worth. And at this time I'd become so engaged with music and I'd started dabbling in music writing. I sent in a review to Cream magazine and they published it and paid me $30 for it. So I got charged up that I wanted to go home and I wanted to write about music, but home wasn't Fort Worth. Fort Worth has a great history, but it had no scene. Something was happening in Austin and I knew about it. I'd visited Austin all during my youth. I'd almost gone to UT, but I'd chosen other colleges, but I moved to Austin in 73 with a specific idea to write about music. And part of this was most anyone else that was writing about music would have moved to LA, New York, maybe Nashville. No one was moving to Austin on purpose. There was one writer there, Chet Flippo, who was writing missives for Rolling Stone and for Cream magazine. And man, reading him got me homesick. I mean, it's like, yeah, this is what I grew up with. I want this. And I moved to Austin in 73 and started going out to clubs and perfect timing, everything. There was a lot going on. It was a very nascent scene. It was very hyper local. No one really gave a shit about what was going on anywhere else. It's like, we're creating our own scene here. And it was based on two elements to me. And one was this tradition of country music always existed, but hippies in Texas, you didn't embrace country music. That's what you rebelled against. It's like you rebelled against Okie from Muskogee, not knowing that Merle Haggard was really a hipster and was doing a parody song. But, you just thought all things country were hillbilly and honky tonk. And, it's just, you had to go a long way to come around to embracing it. But in fact, that's what was happening. I mean, we had cues like the Bird Sweetheart of the Rodeo, Flying Burrito Brothers, all this music on the West Coast. And then all of a sudden in Austin, it was mainly folkies wearing cowboy hats. And that would be Michael Murphy, Jerry Jeff Walker, Willis Allen Ramsey. These were the big dogs in Austin when I arrived. B.W. Stevenson actually had some hit singles. And then there were two outliers. One was a guy that I was really personally drawn to. I'd loved his music. And he was just kind of like this ultimate character to me, a guy named Doug Somm, who Doug had been a San Antonio child prodigy playing all this music and wound up in San Francisco in the late 60s. And when he moves back to Texas around 1970, 71, he moves briefly back to his hometown, San Antonio. But San Antonio doesn't go for guys with long hairs wearing, even if they're wearing cowboy hats. And he got beat up by sheriffs. And so he landed in Austin. It was a safe space. And that was pretty important because he signaled to hippies, it wasn't like if you were a hippie and had ambition, you went to San Francisco in Austin back then in the late 60s, early 70s. And here's a guy that was coming back. Janis Joplin, Johnny Winter, Steve Miller, all these people moved out there. No, this guy came back and he landed in Austin and he said, prettier women, better weather. So that got a lot of eyebrows. And then the other side of that Doug dynamic was this other two guys were signed to this label, Atlantic Nashville, which was started by the legendary Jerry Wexler, the great guy that discovered, Aretha Franklin, Sam and Dave, kind of established soul music on Atlantic Records. Well, he starts a new label called Atlantic Nashville. And his first signing, he comes to Austin, he signs Doug Somm. That's a big deal in Austin. And the second guy he signs is this old country guy who came to Austin. He's 40 years old. And listen, in country music time, when you measure that out, when you're 40 years old, you're selling insurance, or you're maybe working for the record label. You're retired. You're done with country music. But this guy, Willie Nelson, had the benefit of having his house burned down outside of Nashville right before Christmas of 1970. He and his band kind of spent a lot of time on this dude ranch, defunct, bankrupt dude ranch near Bandera. And it was only because Willie came to see his sister Bobbi, who was playing piano bars in Austin, that he discovered Austin, the Armadillo World headquarters. It was basically, the band had, Willie and his boys had an old Winnebago. And it was really a beat up deal, but that's how they got around back then. Nashville recording artists traveling all around the country. But Willie had basically, his string had run out in Nashville. And all he knew what to do was to play live. And he played live in this place, Helotes, John T. Flores store outside of San Antonio. They played there every Saturday night. And they started playing around Texas a little bit. And when he discovered Austin, it didn't take long for Willie and his drummer manager, Paul English, to put two and two together and approach the Armadillo. And Willie had been seeing this. He played some gigs with hippie bands, with the Conqueror. He'd done some anti-war fundraising benefits. And, this is at a time when Willie moves to Austin. He sees what's going on. He starts growing his hair long. He gets a little diamond stud in his ear lobe, which, it matches his horseshoe diamond pinky ring, which, that was country, the horseshoe diamond pinky ring. The stud in the ear, what's happened to you?
So, Joe Nick, Willie, when he left Nashville about this time, I've seen pictures. He was pretty clean cut. He wore almost a Brooks Brothers suit, had a nice little skinny tie, hair was short. So he arrives in Austin, and then he starts this transformation.
It is a transformation. He basically sees what's going on around him. And Austin at this time, is very much in the summer, it's a t-shirt and cutoff town. And, right at this time, this new thing called jogging. So Willie, you don't see Willie in cowboy boots. You see him with a headband, his hair is growing long, a t-shirt, and running shoes. He's one of the first kind of celebrity joggers in Austin. And it's like his whole crew, you'll see him going down the street, and this becomes a thing. But it's basically, Willie is this guy he's had his run in country music. You're right, in Nashville, where he arrived in 1960, all the way through 1972. First, he became a very successful songwriter with writing songs for people like Ray Price and Farron Young, Hello Walls, for the good times, not for the good, Hello Walls, Nightlife, and writing Crazy for Patsy Cline. All this made Willie a star in Nashville, but Willie wanted to be a performer. He didn't just want to be a songwriter. Farron Young and Ray Price both told him, Willie, why don't you get off the road and quit touring with Ray Price as one of his Cherokee Cowboys and just write songs for us? You can make a lot of money. He said, no, I want to be you. He tried really hard in Nashville to be Ray Price, to be, a performer as well as a composer. And he was successful as a composer. He wasn't that successful as a performer. His records never sold that much. The one place he could play constantly and draw a big crowd was Texas, where he came from. So, he comes back to Texas. That's, home turf. But coming to Austin at this time is like, you're entering a whole different world, because this is the hub of counterculture, all things alternative, hippies, and it's basically San Francisco Junior.
So, Joe, he gets down there to Austin, puts on his bandana, starts jogging around the town. And in Austin in the summer is it's hot, and it's can be dry, my experience. And it's a college town, not much going on in the summer down there. So Willie falls in with the Doug Somm and that group. Armadillo World headquarters, I guess they got that started about the same time.
Armadillo started in 1970, and in 1972, Willie played there, and that kind of changed everything for the Armadillo and for Willie both.
Redhead Stranger. uh, was one of Willie's early albums. Was that after he arrived in Austin?
Well, when Willie came to Austin, he arrived as an RCA recording artist. He had done a string of albums for RCA Nashville. Chet Atkins had produced some. Jerry Bradley had tried, and Felton Jarvis had tried to produce them. Nothing had worked. And so when he came to Austin, what happened within a year is Jerry Wexler shows up, signs him to Atlantic Nashville, and he records 2 albums. The first album, Wexler flies him to New York, and they go to the Atlantic Studios in Nashville, and he records Shotgun Willie, and also a second album, a gospel album called The Troublemaker, in the period of 1 week. No one had ever recorded that quickly at Atlantic, but Willie had been working this Nashville assembly line where you record in 3-hour chunks, and generally you move in and you move out. And so what that album did, Shotgun Willie, was not a commercial success, but what it did was show Willie the possibilities. So it's got horns on it. It's a very eclectic, offbeat album, and it has some good stuff on there, but it basically is all about Willie seeing what he can be or what he can do. And, you know, the title song is great. Shotgun Willie sits around in his underwear, biting on a bullet and pulling out all his hair. And he's trying to write a song. It's about writing a song, which was true. He sat in the hotel bathroom in New York and wrote on the back of a sanitary napkin wrapper the lyrics to this song. And it's really about, you know, you can't do a song if you ain't got nothing to say. It is so self-conscious. And in many respects, this is brilliant. He tried to get deep in Nashville with a few albums, and just, it didn't take. But this was like, Shotgun Willie is all over the place. And then the follow-up album is a concept album about a couple having a divorce called Phases and Stages. And it is brilliant. I mean, you can see where he's pulled out pieces of his Nashville career and all this, but to put his mind as a songwriter and take the perspective of a man going through a divorce and a woman going through the divorce is, to me, it's brilliance. And that album yielded one single that was really moving up the country charts called Bloody Mary Morning. And there was a follow-up that Atlantic Nashville had paired up Willie with a hippie country singer named Tracy Nelson, no relation. And they did a tune called After the Fire Is Gone, and it started charting. And that's when the Arrogant Brothers told Jerry Wexler, this crazy Nashville experiment of yours is going nowhere. We're pulling the plug. So Doug Som's without a label. He ends up, I think, finding when he signs with Warner's or Casablanca. Willie's without a label. But during this time, you know, he signed with Atlantic, and his friend Waylon Jennings has turned him on to this great manager, Neil Reshen, who's a bulldog. He's not a Nashville manager. He's a New York manager. And he's, you know, everybody wants a pit bull if you've got a manager. Neil is that. And he has negotiated, like he did for Waylon, artist control in his contract. He did that with Atlantic. But then after Willie got dropped from Atlantic, he got Willie signed to Columbia Records. And Bruce Lundvall signed him, the president of the label. And, you know, they had that written in more artistic control. Well, so Willie gets a small advance, and he takes that advance and pockets most of it. He takes advantage of a studio that is giving him cheap time up in Garland, Texas, outside of Dallas. And they're trying to sell the studio. Summit Burnett Studios or Autumn Sound rather, is trying to get, Autumn Sound is trying to make a name for themselves. And so they're giving this old country guy who's kind of stirring up a fuss in Austin, they're giving him almost free time. And over the course of 2 weeks, first it begins with Willie coming back from a ski trip with his wife, Connie, and they're up in Steamboat Springs in January. And he's turned to Connie, he said, I got to deliver a new album to Columbia Records. Really? And they start talking about it. And he talks about an old song that he liked as a kid, that he grew up with, that he used to sing to his kids when he was a radio disc jockey in Fort Worth in the 50s, called Redheaded Stranger. He loved that song. It was a kid's song. Right. And they started kind of talking about songs they liked, old songs, new songs. And by the time at the end of the drive back to their place in Austin, Willie had kind of had in his mind another concept album like Faces and Stages. And before they went out and he actually, recorded ideas on his cassette with his dog howling in the background. And his band had not heard any of this till they're up in Garland. And here's what I want to do. And he's got it all in mind. And basically he's telling them all, don't play. Don't play that loud guitar. Keep those drums down. He's got it all in his mind. And he records this album in less than 2 weeks. He plays it for some friends that are saying, I don't know what's, he's got, at this time, you got to understand, he's blowing up in Austin. This has happened for 2 years where all of a sudden he's got a band that's like a jam band on the level of the Grateful Dead or the Allman Brothers. This is not a country band anymore. He's got 2 drummers. He's got Paul English, his longtime drummer, and he hired a new one, Rex Ludwig. He's got a bass player, Chris Etheridge, who he picked up from the Flying Burrito Brothers. Yeah. And when B. Spears comes back from Waylon Jennings' band, he just keeps both of them. He's got 2 drummers, 2 bass players, 2 or 3 guitars, and he is known for doing 3-hour, 4-hour shows. I mean, this is like a juggernaut, but as a recording artist, nothing. And this juggernaut outside of the state of Texas is unknown. He's big in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio, Lubbock and all that, but it hasn't spread. Redheaded Stranger, released in 1975, changes everything. First, he delivers the album to Columbia Records. And Bruce Limbaugh said, this is a nice demo. Now, why don't you go back and finish the album? Billy Sherrill, who's the head of Columbia Nashville, and it's kind of like he's the king of the Nashville sound.
You say Billy Sherrill?
Billy Sherrill, and
he's Billy Sherrill, strings, Tammy Wynette, all of that, right?
Yeah, Billy Sherrill came out of Muscle Shoals, but he became really the creator of what was Columbia's Nashville sound, which was a lot of backup singers. Really big productions, and he's doing George Jones and Tammy Wynette among others. So that's kind of the Billy Sherrill stuff. He goes to Bruce Limbaugh and says, "Let me have it. Let me have it. I'll put some sweetening on it. We'll finish it up." And Neil Reschen goes to Bruce Limbaugh, accompanied by Waylon Jennings, and Bruce gives that line to Neil Reschen. This is a nice demo. Let's go finish it up. And Waylon being Waylon, and Waylon is kind of a larger than life figure, just rears up and puts his whole body up on the desk and gets face to face with Bruce Limbaugh and says, "You don't know what you're talking about. This is a great album. You put it out or else." Basically threatening him. And Bruce Limbaugh told me, he said, the physical presence of Waylon was intimidating. Long and short, the Columbia brass kind of, they wrung their hands, but let's put it out. We'll get them on the next album. Just put it out and let it go. But what everybody didn't realize is, during the 60s, when Willie was trying to make it as a Nashville recording artist, the one thing he was really good at was working radio, because he had been a disc jockey in the 1950s. He knew how radio worked and what the magic of radio. He was a disc jockey.
Waylon had been a disc jockey too, right?
Waylon
out in Arizona.
Up in the KLLL in Lubbock, but also in Littlefield, where he had come from. Yeah. In fact, Willie and Waylon had met in the mid '60s when Waylon was the king of a place called JD's in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was this 2-story nightclub where Waylon basically made his bones before he started recording. He would pack it with 2,000 people every weekend. Willie, when Willie's touring as a Nashville recording artist, stops in Phoenix and meets Waylon. They become friends. And Waylon's saying, "Yeah, I'm headed to Nashville. I want to make it." And Willie's saying, "Will you let me know if I can get the JD's job there?" And so Willie is, all during the 60s, when he was a recording artist, he worked radio hard. And he got a couple top 10 country hits, which really didn't mean much monetarily, but he knew all the disc jockeys. And, when he was on the radio in the 50s, in Fort Worth in particular, he kind of he did a radical thing is he'd play records, but he'd also sing along with them on his guitar, and he'd sing, and then he'd play live. That's where he got to know Paul English. He'd play live. That's where he started playing Red-Headed Stranger on KCNC, because his kids would be at home, and he'd sing them. That was their nap time music.
So Joe Nick, you mentioned he got to know Paul English. Let me ask you about this relationship. In your book, you talk about Willie and Paul English in some of these clubs up in Texas, and Paul English seemed to be sort of the collector of the. He made sure that the bills were paid and the money was transferred, and he was a bit of a heavy in a heavy environment. Tell us a little bit about that relationship.
Well, Paul English goes back to meeting Willie in 55 at KCNC when Paul was a teenager, and Paul was tagging along with his brother Oliver Franklin, who was a great guitarist. But Paul really took after Willie. Willie let Paul sit in on the radio, play brushes, and this kind of empowered Paul. Paul went on not to play music, but he was what we call in Fort Worth a character. And, in other places you might call them mobsters or hoodlums. He was a character. And he learned his way through it. I mean, he used to be in, beat up kids. I mean, gang hoodlumism. But then, he kind of got pretty smart. He said, after robbing houses and getting caught and getting thrown in jail, that he learned, you do crimes, you steal stuff. You don't do crimes against people. That way you won't get as much time. You'll just get fined. He learned how to play chess in jail, but he was a character and became a very good character. He was a pimp. He ran women. There'll be some great stories about pimping women for Desi Arnaz whenever he would come visit Dallas and Fort Worth. Paul was that kind of a guy, but, and he's also, in the world of characters, was known as an honest, square guy. So he was a judge. Whenever there was a beef, two people had a beef, they'd take it to the judge and he would decide what was going on. So Paul had a really great business going on, and it blew up, and he had to move. He went to Dallas because the cops got on his case in Fort Worth. And by the mid-60s, he's in Houston, and he's got a really good trade. And every time Willie is touring through Texas, he makes sure when he's in Houston, he stops and stays with Paul. He loves Paul, and Paul loves Willie. So when at one point in 65, right after Willie does the live album at Panther Hall, which was kind of a radical move, but he did that with Johnny Bush and with Wade Ray as a three-piece, and he's looking for a drummer. So he calls Paul and says, I'm looking for Tommy Rosnowski. Tommy was a good drummer for Fort Worth, a good swing drummer. Well, Paul said, what do you want him for? Well, I need a new drummer again. And Paul said, well, what about me? He was like, well, what about you? He said, I can drum. And it didn't take long for Willie to put two and two together. It's like his talent as a drummer was not what was important. What was important was Paul was a character. He knew the real rules of the road. I mean, let's talk about
the real rules of the road. There you go.
Yeah. And so in music, and especially in country music at this time, your rules of the road is you need muscle, and you always need someone needs to be carrying a gun to make sure you get paid, and you need muscle. And Paul was the dream guy. Here's the drummer who's watching Willie's back as he plays. Off the stage, he's watching Willie's back all the time. And for Paul, he was making a boatload of money doing his businesses, and he took a pay cut to go on the road with Willie because he loved Willie that much, and he thought that much about him, and he cared about him. I mean, talk about the passion. He's going to look out for him, and he sure enough did. And it's like, you don't mess with Paul. I did a subsequent feature on Paul in the Oxford American. You should go check it out sometime, because it is about, he was Willie's character. He was Willie's guy with the gun. And bottom line is, you don't fuck with Paul English. And that continued to his death. There was always that reputation. He wore black. He liked the idea when he was with Willie. He started getting kind of a Satan's goatee and beard. And they're in LA, and they're walking down Hollywood Boulevard past Fredericks, and in some shop they see a cape, and Willie says, that's you. And he buys the cape for Paul. So when he goes out on stage, he has this cape and a black hat. He looks like the devil. And, just the way he comported himself, you always treated him with respect and with a distance, because that was the kind of guy that you knew if you crossed him, you didn't want him to go off, not on you. So Paul became this great addition to Willie's band. And the song Me and Paul, which tells about their adventures while Willie's still a country music singer. And those are true adventures.
That's a great song. Yeah.
It's a great song, but, Paul when I was working on the book, I was always trying to figure out the dynamics, the relationships, who's number one in Willie's life, who's most important. And in my mind, it was very clear. Number one was his sister, Bobbi, who just passed. There was no closer relationship, and that was lifelong. And it was just unassailable. But second, number two, was his best friend, Paul English. No question in my mind.
Joe Nick, when you talk to people outside of Texas and you do the word test, Willie Nelson, two things come up. Birthday, 4th of July picnics and weed. Tell us first about the 4th of July picnics.
Okay, so in 1972, I think it was still in the spring, in March, the Dripping Springs reunion was organized, which was a country music festival. And it was all these promoters from Nashville. And it was mainly a country music show. I think Ernest Tubb was on the bill, Tex Ritter. I mean, it was really traditional country. And then, Willie and a handful of these Austin knuckleheads were thrown on the bill. And it was basically, as an event, was a disaster. Not many people showed up. But it did two things. And one is later that summer, Willie makes the move to play at the Armadillo. That's one thing. And the other thing is then the next spring, he calls up Eddie Wilson at the Armadillo and said, remember that Dripping Springs reunion? Let's do one. Let's do our own. And so it was this really unlikely coalition of the Armadillo World Headquarters and its staff of hippies, and a handful of people associated with that, and Willie and his thieves. And I say that very kindly. His thieves were the guys that did his concert promotion in Texas in the 1960s. And these guys were all thieves. They all kind of skimmed off the top. As Willie said, better to know the thief who's stealing from you than if you don't know him. And so he brought in his thieves and he was going to divvy it up. And it was, so it was on this ranch, the Hurlbut Ranch outside of Dripping Springs, Texas, a 4th of July picnic. And a picnic, the idea sounds good. 4th of July in Texas? Are you crazy? I mean, 95, 100 degrees on a treeless field. You're going to go spend 3 days there and get loaded, listening to music. And yet, that's what happened.
Yeah.
It was a success in the sense a lot of people showed up, somewhere like 50, 75,000, they say, but it wasn't a success in that the crowd started breaking the fences like almost immediately. We never know who paid. The Armadillo people claimed that Willie's thieves skimmed all this money away from them. It was, as a business venture, it was horrific. And it kind of led to the breakup of the Armadillo and Willie's people. The Armadillo people complained to him about, we don't like all your people. We asked them not to wear their guns backstage and all that. we're hippies. We don't like guns. And, Willie, if you don't like my friends, you must not like me. And that was followed by an FU call from Willie's manager to the Armadillo. And that ended that. But it also set the stage. I mean, things were already in motion. So the first picnic was in Dripping Springs. The second one, which I attended, was in 1974 at Bryan, Texas, near College Station at a motor raceway. And again, open field, 100-degree heat, no trees. And it was brutal. I mean, it was just really just brutal. And if you ever see the Robert Earl Keen album cover to the album Picnic, you'll see it's a car with smoke burning from it. That's his car that was on fire in the field at Willie's second 4th of July picnic. The third 4th of July picnic was in Liberty Hill outside of Austin, about 30 miles northwest. And to me, that one was the one. That was in 1975, right before Red-Headed Strangers getting released, and 75,000 people, wild, over the top, but no one got killed, no one got hurt, and there was no real darkness. That was that was peak Willie, 1975, and it's all coming together in such a way, and he is turning into a one-name superstar, known nationally and soon internationally. That one did it. But 76 the next year, there's all this pushback in community. That one was in Gonzales, and there had been like a mass gathering act passed by the Texas legislature to try to tamp down these hippie gatherings, and the sheriffs were making all kinds of threats. And Willie's main promoter, one of his thieves, Gene McCausland, boy, he was a character. So I go down with a friend of mine for a small magazine, picking up the Tempo magazine. And Nelson Allen and I drove down 2 weeks before the event to go talk to Gino. And Gino is so coked up. You can just, I mean, he's just agitated. And, we're not even 10 minutes in the conversation. He pulls out his gun and puts it on the table. And it's like, Gino, we're reporters. Come on, there's no business here. And it just turned dark. There were people, someone got killed at the event. Willie never played his set. He sat in with a bunch of bands. The thing got kind of cut short by the third day, and it turned dark. And that was basically the end of the first main picnics. The idea of the picnic has continued in many different iterations. In the early 80s, he held picnics for 2 years at his golf course compound in Spicewood outside of Austin. It's moved around. Lately, it's been at the Circuit of America's racetrack in Austin, which is completely soulless, but it keeps going. It's been kind of superseded now, I think, by Farm Aid, which started in the late 80s, early 90s, and moves around the country. And it's in collaboration with John Cougar Mellencamp and Neil Young. But this is a Willie organized event, and it's basically him talking about where he grew up. He grew up in Abbott in a very poor farming community, and he worked on the book. People remember him, and he remembers them. He owns.
So Nick, just tell the audience where Abbott is geographically in Texas.
Abbott is a little town of 200 or 300. It's a cotton growing community, about 35 miles north of Waco, and probably 65, 70 miles south of Dallas. I'd put it, that's about where it is. And right off of Interstate 35, US Highway 81, right in up the backbone of Texas. And it's where Willie's grandparents moved from Arkansas, from up around the Buffalo River, the Buffalo Valley. It's where Willie's parents moved, seeking a better life, because they lived in Arkansas, and it was hard scrabble living. His grandparents were singing school teachers. They would go around. His grandfather was a blacksmith, and his grandmother was a homemaker, but they were singing school teachers. They would go to communities and take over a schoolhouse or a church for a week or two, and using shape notes, teach the whole town music, how to do music, and they get paid in chickens and cows and sometimes money. So these grandparents that moved down with Willie's parents, who were 16-year-old newlyweds. They moved to Abbott. And this was, Great Depression. These were tough times, and it was hard scrabble. And, the Nelsons were poor. As the locals say, the Nelsons were so poor, their horse was a cow named Reddy. They didn't even have money for a horse. But Willie never forgot where he came from. He owns the grocery store that you come into Abbott, the store, one store that's open. That's Willie's, where Bobbi Lee and Willie Hugh grew up and were raised and really basically started their music careers. When that congregation grew so small that the church was closing, the congregation moved off to nearby Hillsboro, and that building was probably going to be sold. Willie and Bobbi bought the church, and they have kept it going as a volunteer Methodist church. And I was lucky enough to see, after they bought it, they did a big service. Leon Russell was there, a huge gospel service. It was just packed, and that was great. But I got to go back maybe 6 months later. I'd heard that, Willie and Bobbi may be going to church on Sunday. You might want to go up there. And to go to this church, a very small church, and there weren't 50 people in the congregation. There's Bobbi playing the piano like she'd been doing since she was a little girl. Willie showed up a little bit, during the service, but, he showed up, and within a few minutes, he's singing Family Bible, the song that he wrote and sold to Claude Gray for $35 before he got it back, one of his first hit songs. But to hear him sing Family Bible in the church where he was raised with his sister accompanying him, I've heard a lot of gospel music, but I don't think I felt closer to the Spirit than at that moment. I mean, it was stunning.
So Nick, one of the things that has caught people's attention over the years about Willie is his advocacy for marijuana, and the famous story about his bus being stopped and all that came with that. There's so much Willie Nelson lore I'd like to unpack from you, but you're running up against the clock here, I know, here shortly. But talk for a minute about Willie and weed, and sort of where did that come from, and what does it mean to that culture down there?
Well, as far as Willie and weed, put it into early perspective, in the 50s when he first smoked knowingly, he might have tried it. He smoked like grapevine as a kid. I mean, all rural kids did that around Texas. They try to smoke whatever they could. But Willie, in back of the Stagecoach Inn in Fort Worth, someone introduces him to weed, and he smokes it, and kind of likes it. And he's smoking it during the 60s. I mean, in the 60s, even though he's a Nashville recording artist, lives outside of Nashville, he's getting into experimental religion through Wade Ray, his fiddle player, introduces him to this thing called Astara, which is, it's a different kind of spirituality thinking. And I don't know if LSD is involved yet, but there's weed out there, but it's not in a big way. Well, let's put it this way. It's in a big enough way that when Willie's house burns down in 1970, Christmas Eve, he's called, your house is burning down. He rushes back. And what does he do? He rushes inside to get his guitar and a bale of weed out of there before the cops come or anyone else comes. So there's interest, but he's also a drinker. And as Paul English and Willie's oldest daughter, Luana, said, he could get really wild when he drank. Paul would always have to take his keys because Willie would want to drive, and he couldn't drive with a dam when he was drunk. And and as they put it, when he got to Austin, where all of a sudden he's in an environment with the hippies, where weed is not something that you hide. It's okay to bring it out and smoke, and everybody's doing it kind of out in the open, even though it's illegal and this can put you in prison. Willie kind of gets it, and as Lana said, he understands how it tamps down the rage, and the rage that when he would get enraged when he'd get drunk. But weed was kind of a different thing, and his wife Connie at the time, it really suited him well, and he liked it, and he kind of embraced it. It helped. Again, Doug Somm had come from San Francisco. Doug had learned to smoke weed in the 50s in Texas through a Western swing fiddler, J.R. Chatwell, who used to go down to Laredo and buy weed and just drive it across. No big deal. No one thought much about it. So in country music, there was an element, but I'd say at the time in the 50s and 60s, even more popular than booze would be any kind of speed, Benzedrine, Benny, something to keep you going. That was the drug of choice. In Austin, in the early 1970s, weed was the drug of choice of hippies. And, it turns out you learn Ray Price, Willie's mentor, he'd been smoking since the 60s.
Is that right? Wow.
Well, there's a joke. And
Willie Price, yeah.
Willie used to use this line. It's like Ray Price went at a bus auction. What are you talking about, Willie? Well, Ray had an old bus he's traveling around with, and he hadn't been making his payments, and it got confiscated, and they were going to auction it off, and it had a shitload of weed in there. So Ray had to go to the auction and buy his bus back so he wouldn't get popped. So this tradition had been running all through country music, but it was not overt. Willie was the one, especially because he wasn't in Nashville anymore. He's in Austin, this strange place where there's all these hippies and stuff going on. So he could be open about it. And he was, to the point that I think since the late 70s, there has been no more passionate personality or spokesman associated with marijuana than Willie Nelson. There have been rivals. And you might say, well, what about Snoop Dogg? Well, I would offer to you, go into a legal weed store in Colorado and ask for Snoop Dogg product versus Willie's Reserve product. Willie's Reserve is like 10 to 1. And Jeremy Tepper, who programs Willie's Roadhouse on Sirius XM radio, told me, he said, yeah, it wasn't, 2 or 3 years ago, Willie was parked for a week right out in front of the Radio City Music Hall. He was doing like a bunch of shows in New York. And so the bus was parked out there. So it was kind of a game to watch who was lined up trying to get on the bus. And he said Snoop Dogg and his family would wait to get on. Willie had this stuff, not Snoop Dogg. And there's a great story when Willie's in right around 2006 or so, Willie plays a week at the Hollywood Bowl. And while he's there, Mrs. Gene Autry, the widow of Gene Autry, one of Willie's cowboy star heroes and a good friend, they became good friends in life. Mrs. Gene Autry arrives to give Willie 2 pairs of Gene's old boots, which Willie's sister Bobbi says he immediately put them on and would not take them off the whole week. Willie was so into Gene Autry. Well, Mrs. Autry is like straight as an arrow. She comes on board on the bus and she's hanging out on the bus. She didn't say anything while she's on the bus, but it's when she steps off the bus, she steps off and looks around and says, it smells funny here. I mean, Willie's bus is like, it's when he did the gospel show in Abbott, it was so strange to watch. I stood out right by his bus and, you smell, if you're going to smoke weed, you go smoke with Willie because he's got the best stuff out there. And I've smoked weed with Willie. And it's the gold standard. But to be out in front of his Abbott Methodist Church on a Sunday, and it's not even noon, and the place is packed, the church is packed, the crowd outside is packed, and I'm standing right by the bus in front of a line of sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, and man, you can smell that stuff from here to tomorrow. These sheriffs are all just cheering and having a good time because it's Willie Nelson. So he makes people forget about what the law is and isn't. Every time he's gotten popped, he's fought it. When I interviewed him for the book, my last long interview was in Santa Rosa, California, after he played a week at the Fillmore Auditorium, and we ended up in Santa Rosa on an off day, and he gave me all the time I wanted. And afterwards, I said, where are you going to go afterward? Well, I've got to drive to Louisiana. He had his crew driving to Louisiana because he had been popped in Louisiana. He was going to fight the case. And then he was going to drive in the bus all the way back and resume gigs in California. But to Willie, that's life. He loves the road. And again, he rolled the first night of those 2 days that I interviewed him long. It was 3 a.m. and I'm trying to remember what I asked him and what the next question is going to be. and he smoked me under the table. I'm pretty good about this. I've got a pretty good constitution. He smoked. I couldn't remember what I'd asked and went, okay, no mas, I give. And so that's when, well, here's your hotel room. We're in Santa Rosa, California. Let's talk the next day. And we did. But, waited till early in the afternoon. And Willie had ridden his bike around in the morning. He had a little bicycle with him. And I said, so Willie, you ever get lost in that thing? He said, all the time. I said, so what do you do? He said, I just walk up to a door, knock on it. I'm Willie Nelson. Can you tell me where I am? And I said, I always find my way back. So the second day, though, we smoked again. And he rolled it up a joint. Here, take it. And I was so wasted. I went to bed early, but I had a flight out of San Jose the next day. So I had to drive from Santa Rosa to San Jose. And damned if I was going to waste that joint. And so I'm in the car and I'm smoking. I shouldn't be doing this, but smoke this joint. And all of a sudden I'm going over the Richmond East Bay Bridge. And I'm having this moment where the bridge is like my line of sight. Everything's narrowing to tunnel vision. And I'm sweating. It's like I got my hand on the wheel and it's like I'm freezing. And I'm hoping I get off the bridge, and I do. God, what? I shouldn't have smoked that stuff. And I told Willie's ex-wife, Connie, afterwards, I said, man, I had a moment on that bridge smoking that Willie weed. And she said, I'll tell Willie, he loves hearing that. He's funny.
But so Nick, a Florida songwriter, Scotty Emmerich and Toby Keith did record a song sounded similar to that, but I'll never smoke weed with Willie. I won't go on this tour bus again. Hey, we got to wrap this up. You need to move along, and we're going to run out of time here. But on Willie's birthday here, April the 29th, any final thought for you on what Willie Nelson, the musician, the Texan, what's going to be his legacy?
Oh, I have a hard time going there. And all I can say is, he's been that person on my watch during my lifetime. There has been no one or nothing like him. He is, as far as music, as far as representing in a positive way Texas culture, and the weed thing too. I mean, a friend of the family farmer, all these things. He is a most remarkable individual. And when you do a biography like I did, and I tend to I suck the marrow out of his bone. And, once I've done that, it's not like I'm going to go. I haven't been hanging out with Willie a whole lot since. I mean, he was very kind to me in letting me, and being cooperative. And this was an unauthorized book. But, after doing that, you tend to see all, warts and all. But what I like to be able to conclude and say this is, he's that guy you think he is. And that's something that's a talent or a characteristic that I think every politician and every celebrity wishes they had. But whatever you want to telegraph onto him, you're probably right. And that's what's pretty cool. So, whatever you think he is, he is that. And I just feel like it has been beyond remarkable to get to write stories about this guy, because his stories are the best stories of my time. So his legacy has been, to me, he's Texas, and he's what's right about Texas. He's everything good about Texas, and he's everything good about music, and he's everything good about storytelling. And in this particular moment in time when so much of what I said good about Texas, there's so many reasons to think negatively about my place and my culture. And thank God for Willie Nelson to correct that record and to show people what it's really like and what it can be.
Joe Nick Patoski, author of in my opinion, the definitive Willie Nelson biography, and several other books. You've written about Selena and other musicians in Texas, has been our guest today. Joe Nick, thank you for sharing your special insights into an American legend, Willie Nelson, on this particular day. Thank you again for being with us. Thank you for sharing all of that. And happy trails to you and all of the great people down in the hill country of Texas.
Well, thank you, and happy birthday, Willie Hugh Nelson.